The heavy oak door creaked open, a sound swallowed by the hushed murmurs of the courtroom. 8:57 a.m., 3 minutes early. Zariah Benton, all of 19 years old, stepped inside, the click of her heels a deliberate counterpoint to the shuffling of papers and hushed whispers. Her tailored pantsuit, a deep, almost navy blue, was a calculated choice, youthful yet professional, a silent defiance of expectations. She wasn't trying to look older. She was aiming for respect, a respect she knew she wouldn't be given freely. 3 minutes can be an eternity, she thought, her gaze sweeping over the room, registering every detail: the worn leather of the judge's chair, the flickering fluorescent lights, the almost palpable tension in the air. Each inhale was a measured intake of the courtroom's atmosphere, a silent promise to herself. I'm here to win. This wasn't just about her client. It was about every voice that had been silenced, every injustice overlooked. The bailiff's voice, amplified by the courtroom's acoustics, cut through the low hum. All rise. The familiar words sent a ripple through the room. Zariah moved towards the defense table, her pace even, her expression carefully neutral. As she settled into her seat, the opposing counsel, a man whose face spoke of years spent navigating the legal labyrinth, stared at her with undisguised confusion. He had been expecting a seasoned lawyer, a name he recognized, not this girl. His eyes, sharp and assessing, flickered over her, searching for some sign of inexperience, some crack in her composure. He thinks I'm a student, she realized, a flicker of amusement dancing in her eyes, quickly masked by a professional calm. Let him think that. Be seated, the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the silent chamber. Judge Lennox, his face etched with the weariness of countless cases, settled into his chair, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom, finally landing on Zariah. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Zariah met his gaze without flinching. He doubts me too, she thought, her heart beating a steady rhythm against her ribs. Good. Let them doubt. Doubt could be a weapon, a shield against their preconceived notions. It gave her the element of surprise. The opposing counsel, still recovering from his initial shock, cleared his throat. Ma'am, he began, his voice tinged with condescension. This table's for counsel. I am counsel. He gestured vaguely towards the plaintiff's table. The subtle insult, intended to diminish her, barely registered. Zariah's voice, calm and clear, cut through the courtroom's stillness. I am Zariah Benton, attorney for Mr. Rials. She presented her bar card, the small, rectangular piece of plastic a symbol of her hard-won right to be there. The opposing counsel's face flushed slightly, a mixture of embarrassment and annoyance flickering across his features. Now he knows, Zariah thought, a flicker of satisfaction warming her chest. But it's too late. The case began, the familiar legal dance unfolding. Officer Kilroy, a man built like a linebacker, took the stand, his uniform crisp, his demeanor radiating an air of authority. He answered the prosecution's questions with practiced ease, his voice confident, his gaze unwavering. Zariah watched him, her mind a whirlwind of calculations. She knew his type, the officer who believed his badge was a shield against accountability. She had studied his bodycam footage, his incident report, every detail, every discrepancy. He thinks he's untouchable, she thought, her fingers tracing the cool metal of the pen in her hand. He's wrong. The prosecution finished their questioning. It was Zariah's turn. She rose from her seat, her movements deliberate, her gaze locking onto Kilroy's. He smirked, a dismissive curl of his lip that sent a wave of anger through her. She swallowed it down, transforming it into a cold, focused determination. Officer Kilroy, she began, her voice cutting through the courtroom's expectant silence. You stated in your report that you stopped Mr. Rials for erratic driving. Can you elaborate on what constituted erratic driving in this instance? Kilroy leaned back in his chair, his posture radiating arrogance. He was weaving, he said, his tone dismissive, a clear sign of intoxication. Weaving, Zariah repeated, her voice neutral. And you activated your body cam immediately upon initiating the stop, as per department protocol? Of course, Kilroy replied, his voice laced with impatience. What is this, debate club? He glanced at the gallery, eliciting a ripple of laughter. The judge's gavel cracked against the sound block. The laughter died down, replaced by a tense silence. Zariah felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, but she forced herself to remain calm. He's trying to intimidate me, she realized. He thinks this is a game. No, Officer Kilroy, she said, her voice steady. This is a court of law, and in this court we deal in facts. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. Now, would you mind telling the court why your body cam footage shows a full 30 seconds of inactivity before the recording begins? Kilroy's face stiffened. The casual confidence he had displayed moments before began to crumble. He stammered, There must have been a malfunction. A malfunction, Zariah echoed, her voice laced with a subtle irony that didn't escape Judge Lennox's attention. A malfunction that conveniently erased the initial interaction between you and Mr. Rials. An interaction during which, I believe, Mr. Rials was driving perfectly within the speed limit, following all traffic laws, and posing no threat to public safety. She stepped closer to the witness stand, her gaze unwavering. Isn't that right, Officer Kilroy? The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Kilroy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze darting around the courtroom, avoiding hers. The courtroom held its breath. The opposing counsel, his face pale, began to scribble furiously on his notepad. He hadn't seen this coming. Nobody had, except Zariah. She had anticipated every move, every lie, every desperate attempt to maintain the facade. And now the facade was crumbling. Piece by piece, she was dismantling his testimony, exposing the truth beneath the carefully constructed lies. From the corner of her eye, Zariah saw her client, Mr. Rials, watching her with a mixture of awe and gratitude. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. This is for you, she thought, her voice a silent promise in the hushed courtroom. This is for everyone who has ever been silenced. The air crackled with anticipation. The game had changed, and Zariah Benton, the 19-year-old lawyer everyone had underestimated, was holding all the cards. The ripple of laughter, a low hum of disbelief that had followed her seemingly naive opening statement, still vibrated in the air. Zariah Benton felt it, a subtle tremor against her skin, but she didn't flinch. Her grip on the worn leather of her legal pad tightened, the familiar texture grounding her. Let them laugh, she thought, the corner of her lip almost imperceptibly lifting. Their amusement will fade soon enough. Judge Lennox tapped his gavel, the sound sharp in the hushed courtroom, restoring a semblance of order. His gaze, initially laced with a hint of patronizing amusement, now held a flicker of curiosity. He too was waiting, watching her. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny, but it didn't unsettle her. It was fuel. Let's proceed, Judge Lennox said, his voice neutral. Defense is ready to proceed with cross-examination, Your Honor. Zariah responded, her voice clear and steady, projecting through the courtroom. A small part of her, the part still raw from years of being underestimated, savored the moment. 19 years old. They saw a girl playing dress-up in a courtroom, a child dabbling in a world she didn't understand. They were about to learn differently. She met Officer Kilroy's gaze across the room. He was smirking, a dismissive curl of his lip that spoke volumes. He saw her as a lamb led to slaughter, a law student barely out of diapers. The arrogance radiating off him was almost palpable, a thick fog of self-importance. He thinks he's already won, she thought, her pulse a steady drumbeat against her ribs. He's wrong. Officer Kilroy, Zariah began, her voice carefully modulated. You've been on the force how long? Kilroy shifted in his seat, his posture radiating a casual confidence that bordered on insolence. 15 years, counselor, he replied, his voice laced with a condescending drawl. He deliberately emphasized the word counselor, a subtle jab at her youth. Zariah ignored the slight. 15 years, she repeated, allowing the words to hang in the air, letting the jury absorb the weight of his experience. 15 years upholding the law, 15 years protecting the citizens of this city, 15 years familiarizing yourself with the proper procedures for conducting a traffic stop. Is that correct? Kilroy puffed out his chest, a slight preening in his posture. That is correct. He seemed to relish the spotlight, the opportunity to showcase his supposed expertise. He was playing to the jury, projecting an image of authority and competence. Zariah watched him, her mind a steel trap, cataloging every micro-expression, every subtle shift in his demeanor. She was building a profile brick by brick. Inside, a storm of carefully controlled calculation raged. Arrogance is a shield, she reminded herself. Pride comes before a fall. And in those 15 years, she continued, her voice smooth as silk, I presume you've conducted countless traffic stops, hundreds, perhaps even thousands. I wouldn't be able to give you an exact number, counselor, Kilroy replied, a touch of impatience creeping into his tone. But yes, a considerable amount. Of course, Zariah said, a faint smile playing on her lips. A man of your experience wouldn't be bothered with such trivial details, would he? The barb, subtle yet sharp, landed. Kilroy's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a fleeting flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He recovered quickly, but Zariah had seen it. The first crack in his armor. Let's move this along, counselor, he said, his voice tight. My time is valuable. Zariah ignored his thinly veiled attempt to steer the conversation. I understand, she said, her voice soft, almost sympathetic. Let's talk about a specific traffic stop then. Shall we? The courtroom air thickened, a palpable shift in the atmosphere. The quiet rustle of anticipation rippled through the gallery. Zariah could feel the weight of all eyes upon her, the collective breath held in suspense. Let's discuss the traffic stop involving Mr. Dion Rials on April 6th of this year, she continued, her voice unwavering. The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Kilroy's eyes narrowed, a shadow passing over his face. His jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his skin. He'd underestimated her. He hadn't anticipated this level of preparedness, this meticulous attention to detail. He thought he could brush her off, dismiss her as a nuisance. He was starting to realize he was wrong, very wrong. Zariah allowed a beat of silence to stretch, letting the tension build. The courtroom was utterly still, the silence punctuated only by the quiet hum of the air conditioning. She could practically hear the gears turning in Kilroy's mind, the frantic scramble to regain control. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. The game has just begun, officer, she thought, a flicker of steel in her eyes, and I intend to win. The stale air of the courtroom hung heavy, thick with the anticipation that only prolonged silence could cultivate. Zariah Benton, all of 19 years old, stood before the witness stand, her tailored suit a stark contrast to the rumpled uniform of Officer Dennis Kilroy. Her gaze, unwavering and sharp as obsidian, held Kilroy's. Beneath the surface of her composed exterior, a storm of calculated moves brewed. He thinks I'm a child playing dress-up. The thought, a flicker of amusement and icy determination, flitted through her mind. Let him think that. Officer Kilroy, Zariah's voice, though quiet, resonated with a steely confidence that belied her age. Did you have your body camera activated during the traffic stop in question? Kilroy shifted uneasily, his initial swagger replaced by a thin veneer of irritation. Of course, counselor. Standard procedure. Standard procedure to selectively edit the footage later. Too, he thought, a bitter taste rising in his throat. This girl, barely old enough to vote, was making him sweat. Excellent, Zariah replied, her lips curving into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The subtle shift in her expression didn't escape Kilroy, sending a prickle of unease down his spine. He couldn't quite place it, this unsettling feeling like a predator toying with its prey. The courtroom lights dimmed as the grainy footage flickered to life on the large screen, illuminating the faces of everyone present with an eerie glow. The stop sign, partially obscured by an overgrown oak tree, materialized on the screen. Zariah's heart hammered against her ribs, a steady rhythm against the chaotic symphony of her thoughts. This is it. The linchpin. Officer Kilroy, your report states that Mr. Rials ran a stop sign. Can you point to the exact moment in the footage where this infraction occurred? Kilroy pointed a thick finger towards the screen, his hand trembling slightly. Right there. See? He clearly doesn't come to a complete stop. Zariah's carefully constructed composure remained unfazed. Inside, however, a thrill of anticipation coursed through her. He's falling for it. The view of the stop sign appears to be obstructed. Wouldn't you agree, officer? Her voice was soft, almost gentle, yet the underlying accusation hung in the air like a guillotine. Kilroy's jaw clenched. It's partially obscured, yes, but partially obscured, Zariah echoed, cutting him off. So, you admit that you couldn't have definitively seen whether Mr. Rials came to a complete stop. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Lennox, his expression unreadable, leaned forward slightly. Kilroy felt the heat of the spotlight, the weight of the judge's gaze, and the unsettling sharpness of Zariah's questions pressing down on him. I based my judgment on his overall behavior, he stammered, grasping for an explanation. He seemed twitchy. Zariah pounced. Twitchy. She repeated the word, letting it hang in the air. Did you conduct any field sobriety tests, Officer Kilroy? No, he admitted grudgingly. Any drug screenings? No. So, on what basis? Zariah's voice rose slightly, resonating with controlled power. Did you determine that Mr. Rials was probably high, as you stated in your report? Kilroy felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. He could see the doubt clouding the judge's face, the growing murmurs of the courtroom weaving a tapestry of his impending doom. Damn this girl and her meticulous preparation. Zariah paused, letting the silence amplify the weight of his non-answers. Then she played her trump card. Officer Kilroy, are you familiar with a complaint filed against you 2 years ago by Ms. Kendra Simmons, alleging excessive force during a routine traffic stop? Kilroy's blood ran cold. The complaint had been dropped, swept under the rug. How did she? That doesn't matter now. Damage control. That complaint was dismissed, he said, his voice tight with barely suppressed panic. Dismissed, yes, Zariah conceded, her voice deceptively calm. But the incident report describes Ms. Simmons as nervous and fidgeting. Does it not? Similar language to your description of Mr. Rial's behavior. The silence that followed was deafening. Kilroy could feel his carefully constructed facade crumbling, piece by piece. He glanced at Judge Lennox, searching for some sign of support, but the judge's face was a mask of judicial neutrality. Zariah met Kilroy's gaze, her eyes burning with a quiet fire. The triumph she felt wasn't just about winning the case. It was about something larger, about dismantling a system built on prejudice and unchecked power, one carefully placed stone at a time. She thought of Mr. Rials, his quiet dignity throughout the ordeal, and the countless others who had been unjustly targeted. This is for them. Officer Kilroy, she said, her voice now carrying the weight of undeniable victory. Isn't it true that you stopped Mr. Rials not because he ran a stop sign, but because, she paused, allowing the unspoken accusation to hang heavy in the air, because he fit a profile? Kilroy's silence was a damning confession. The air in the courtroom crackled with unspoken tension, the unspoken words echoing in the sudden vacuum of sound. The shift was palpable, a seismic tremor in the foundations of Kilroy's carefully constructed reality. He saw it then, reflected in the eyes of everyone present, not just defeat, but the dismantling of his authority. The girl, no, the woman before him, had done more than win a case. She had exposed the cracks in the system, cracks he had exploited for far too long. The silence stretched, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against the remnants of his pride. He finally managed a choked, "No, I." The gavel fell, sharp and decisive, cutting him off. Judge Lennox's voice, though calm, held an undercurrent of steel. Case dismissed. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom hummed, a dull counterpoint to the rhythmic tap of Zariah's heel against the worn carpet. Each click was a measured beat, a silent assertion of her presence in this space. A space where she was underestimated, dismissed. She could feel Kilroy's eyes on her, heavy with a mixture of amusement and annoyance. He still thought this was a game, a performance by a naive law student. Zariah adjusted the microphone, the metallic rasp a small, sharp sound that cut through the expectant murmur of the courtroom. The Plano PD procedural manual felt heavy in her hand, its weight a physical manifestation of the hours she'd poured into it, dissecting its clauses, memorizing its sections. It was her weapon, her shield. Section 5.3, Suspicion-Based Stops. Zariah's voice was clear, amplified by the courtroom's acoustics. Each word landed with precision, a calculated strike against the edifice of Kilroy's arrogance. She could almost taste the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle prickle of anticipation. Judge Lennox leaned forward, his expression neutral but attentive. Kilroy shifted in his seat, a flicker of unease in his eyes. Good, Zariah thought. Let him feel the ground beneath him start to crumble. This section clearly states that an officer must articulate reasonable suspicion based on observable facts, not subjective feelings or hunches. She paused, letting the words hang in the air, watching as they seeped into the consciousness of everyone present. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm against the controlled composure of her exterior. This was it, the crux of her argument, the moment where everything could tip either way. She met Kilroy's gaze, a silent challenge passing between them. "Officer Kilroy," she began, her voice steady. "In your report, you stated that you stopped Mr. Rials because he looked suspicious and seemed nervous. Can you elaborate on what specific, observable facts led you to these conclusions?" Kilroy cleared his throat, his initial swagger replaced by a thin veneer of defensiveness. He was driving a late-model sedan, a common vehicle used in drug trafficking, he replied, his voice tight. Zariah suppressed a sigh. Predictable. And what about his behavior made him seem nervous? He avoided eye contact, Kilroy said, his gaze darting towards Judge Lennox, and he kept fidgeting with his hands. Avoiding eye contact, Zariah repeated, her voice laced with a hint of irony. She flipped through the pages of the manual. Interestingly, in 3 separate incident reports from the past year, all involving young black men, you've cited avoiding eye contact as a justification for a stop. Is it possible, Officer Kilroy, that what you perceive as nervousness is simply the understandable discomfort of a young man of color being scrutinized by a police officer? The silence in the courtroom thickened, heavy with unspoken tension. Kilroy's face flushed crimson. Zariah knew she was walking a tightrope, but she also knew that she couldn't back down. This wasn't just about Mr. Rials. It was about a system that allowed men like Kilroy to operate with impunity. Your Honor, Kilroy sputtered. I object to the insinuation that I am racially biased. Overruled, Judge Lennox stated, his voice even and unwavering. The witness will answer the question. Kilroy's jaw clenched. He opened his mouth to speak, then hesitated, his eyes flickering with a flicker of something akin to panic. Zariah watched him, a strange mix of satisfaction and weariness washing over her. This wasn't just a battle of wits. It was a battle of wills, a battle for the very soul of justice. Zariah took a deep breath, composing herself. She had one final card to play. Officer Kilroy, she said, her voice soft yet resonant. Did you know my client is a high school math teacher at Booker Middle? The air in the courtroom crackled. The question hung there, suspended, its implications reverberating through the silence. Kilroy stared at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. Judge Lennox's eyebrows rose slightly. In the gallery, a quiet gasp rippled through the observers. Zariah allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to play on her lips. She could see the wheels turning in Kilroy's head, the slow, agonizing realization that he'd made a terrible mistake, a mistake born of prejudice and fueled by arrogance. A teacher? Kilroy stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Zariah nodded, her gaze steady. Yes, officer. A teacher. He was on his way home from a late-night grading session when you pulled him over. He was nervous because he was worried about being late, not because he was hiding anything. The courtroom was utterly silent. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade into the background. Zariah could feel the weight of every eye upon her, the collective breath held in anticipation. She met Kilroy's gaze, a silent victory echoing in the space between them. You saw a young black man driving a late-model sedan, she said, her voice rising slightly, gaining strength. And you decided the story for him. You decided he was a criminal without evidence, without justification. You let your biases cloud your judgment. And in doing so, you violated the very principles you swore to uphold. Zariah paused, letting the weight of her words settle upon the courtroom. She looked at Mr. Rials, his face etched with a mixture of relief and gratitude. She looked at Judge Lennox, his expression thoughtful, contemplative. And finally, she looked at Officer Kilroy, his face pale, his eyes devoid of their earlier arrogance. He'd lost. He'd lost more than just this case. He'd lost the illusion of his own authority, the facade of his righteousness. And in his defeat, Zariah had found something more profound than victory. She had found her voice. The air in the courtroom crackled with anticipation, a palpable tension clinging to the silence. Zariah Benton stood before the jury, her posture ramrod straight, her dark eyes holding an unwavering gaze. 19 years old, barely a legal adult herself, she felt the weight of the room, the scrutiny of every eye. They expect me to crumble, she thought, the thought a flicker of steel in the quiet storm of her mind. They see a child playing lawyer. But beneath the composed exterior, a torrent of meticulously organized facts and figures raged, a whirlwind of legal precedent and carefully constructed arguments. She wouldn't crumble. She'd built her case, brick by painstaking brick. Now it was time to unveil it. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the charged atmosphere. The microphone amplified her words, each syllable precise, carrying to every corner of the room. Internally, she ran through her strategy one last time, each point a precisely placed marker on the map of her closing argument. No theatrics, no emotional pleas, just the cold, hard facts. Over the past few days, you have heard testimony, examined evidence, and witnessed the body camera footage from Officer Kilroy's perspective. She paused, letting her words sink in, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the jurors. She saw skepticism, indifference, even a flicker of disdain. Kilroy, seated at the plaintiff's table, wore a mask of bored arrogance. Zariah suppressed a flicker of annoyance. He thinks he's already won. The thought was a cold spark of motivation. She'd show him. The prosecution would have you believe that Mr. Dion Rials, a respected high school math teacher, she gestured towards her client, a quiet man with worried eyes, posed a threat to Officer Kilroy's safety. A threat so imminent, so palpable, that it justified a forceful traffic stop, a thorough search of his vehicle, and a subsequent citation. Her voice dripped with irony, carefully controlled, a scalpel slicing through the pretense. She stepped towards the screen where a still image from the bodycam footage was displayed. It showed Mr. Rial's car, pulled over to the side of the road, his hands clearly visible on the steering wheel. Where, in this image, do you see a threat? Her voice echoed in the sudden hush of the courtroom. She could practically feel the shift in the atmosphere, the jurors' attention sharpening. Officer Kilroy's report cites furtive movements and suspicious behavior as justification for the stop. But when you watched that body cam footage, you didn't see furtive movements. You didn't see suspicious behavior. You saw a man complying with an officer's instructions. A man who, according to the officer's own testimony, had no outstanding warrants, no prior convictions, and no history of violent behavior. Zariah felt a surge of adrenaline, the thrill of the chase, the hunter closing in on her prey. He's getting nervous now. She saw Kilroy shift uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw tightening. The judge, initially skeptical of her youth, now watched with keen interest, his expression neutral but attentive. "All you saw," she continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing the jury to lean forward, "was a feeling on Officer Kilroy's part. A feeling that something wasn't right. A feeling based on what, exactly?" She paused, the silence heavy with unspoken implications. The defense argues that this feeling, this unsubstantiated suspicion, was rooted not in concrete evidence, but in implicit bias. A bias that led Officer Kilroy to target Mr. Rials based on she hesitated, choosing her words with surgical precision, factors unrelated to his driving. Factors that violate not only Mr. Rial's constitutional rights, but also the very departmental policies Officer Kilroy swore to uphold. She produced a copy of the police department's policy on traffic stops, her movements crisp and efficient. This document clearly outlines the procedures officers must follow. Probable cause, reasonable suspicion. These are not mere suggestions, ladies and gentlemen. These are the bedrock of our legal system. And in this case, she slammed the document down on the table, the sound echoing through the silent courtroom. These procedures were disregarded. The impact was palpable. Even Mr. Rials, usually so reserved, looked up at her with a flicker of hope in his eyes. Almost there, she thought, her heart pounding against her ribs. Just one final push. The prosecution's case rests on a foundation of assumptions and prejudices. They ask you to convict Mr. Rials based not on evidence, but on a feeling. Feelings aren't evidence. Feelings, however sincerely held, cannot justify the violation of a citizen's rights. Zariah returned to her position before the jury, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to uphold the principles of justice and fairness. I ask you to see through the assumptions and biases that led to this wrongful accusation. I ask you to find Mr. Dion Rials not guilty." The silence that followed her closing argument was thick with anticipation. Zariah stood, outwardly calm, but inwardly a maelstrom of emotions churned within her. Doubt, hope, fear, and a sliver of steely confidence warred within her. The jury filed out. The wait felt like an eternity. When they returned, the foreman's voice resonated with finality. "Not guilty." Collective gasp filled the courtroom. Relief washed over Zariah, a wave of exhaustion following close behind. Mr. Rials beamed, tears welling in his eyes. He grasped her hand, his gratitude palpable. Kilroy sat stunned, his face a mask of disbelief. Zariah hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding her breath until she exhaled. A shaky breath of air. She'd won. She'd actually won. But even as she registered the victory, a low hum began to build in the courtroom. People were reaching for their phones, their fingers flying across the screens. The verdict, her closing argument, the entire case, it was spreading like wildfire across social media. Zariah Benton, the 19-year-old lawyer who had dared to challenge a seasoned police officer and won, was suddenly a name, a symbol, a viral sensation. The quiet confidence she had cultivated throughout the trial began to waver under the sudden weight of unexpected fame. The courtroom doors opened, and the glare of cameras flashed, momentarily blinding. The world outside, she realized, had just irrevocably changed. The cafe hummed with the low murmur of conversations and the clatter of ceramic mugs. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, painting stripes across the checkered floor. Zariah stirred her iced tea, the clinking of ice a rhythmic counterpoint to the ambient noise. She watched the condensation trickle down the glass, a miniature world of droplets clinging and falling, mirroring the tension that still thrummed beneath her outward calm. The victory in court felt both exhilarating and strangely hollow. It was one battle won, but the war was far from over. Across the table, Mr. Rials radiated relief, his shoulders no longer hunched with the weight of the impending court date. He sipped his coffee, the steam curling around his face like a gentle embrace. "I still can't believe it," he said, shaking his head. I thought I was going to lose my license, maybe even my job." The fear that had gripped him for weeks was still palpable in his voice, a ghost lingering in the edges of his relief. Zariah met his gaze, her expression carefully neutral. Inside, a quiet satisfaction bloomed. It wasn't just about winning this case for Mr. Rials. It was about something much bigger. Officer Kilroy's testimony crumbled under cross-examination, she said, her voice even and controlled. She remembered the way Kilroy's face had tightened, the beads of sweat forming on his upper lip as she meticulously dissected his report, exposing the inconsistencies between his written account and the body cam footage. The memory sent a small, icy thrill through her veins. He kept saying I was misinterpreting things. Mr. Rials chuckled, a tinge of bitterness lacing his amusement. Like I couldn't understand plain English. Like I couldn't see what he was doing. Zariah took another slow sip of her tea. The coolness calmed the lingering adrenaline. He underestimated you, she said, her gaze sharpening. And he underestimated me. The unspoken implication hung in the air between them. He underestimated them because they were black. She didn't need to say it aloud. They both understood. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern, a system. How did you do it? Mr. Rials leaned forward, his voice hushed. He's been a cop for years. He must have testified in hundreds of cases. Zariah placed her glass on the table, the small click echoing in the sudden lull of their conversation. It's not about handling them, she said, her voice low and steady. Each word was carefully chosen, precise, like the pieces of a puzzle she'd meticulously assembled in her mind. It's about cornering them with their own words, their own actions. She could almost taste the bitter tang of Kilroy's defeat. The way his jaw had clenched, the flicker of fear in his eyes when she played the body cam footage. He had thought he was above the law. He had been wrong. You were so calm, Mr. Rials murmured, awe coloring his tone. I was a nervous wreck, but you were like ice. Zariah allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. Calm on the surface, yes, but beneath the carefully constructed facade, a storm raged. A storm of anger, of frustration, of a deep, burning desire for justice. She'd spent countless nights poring over the case files, analyzing every detail, anticipating every possible scenario. Sleep had been a luxury she couldn't afford. Every line of questioning, every objection had been meticulously planned. She hadn't allowed herself the luxury of showing her fear, her doubt. Not in court, not in front of Kilroy. Preparation is key, she said, her voice regaining its professional detachment. And knowing the law, inside and out. But it was more than that. It was about seeing the cracks in the system, the subtle biases, the unspoken assumptions. It was about using those cracks to pry open the truth. Mr. Rials took a deep breath, his shoulders relaxing further. This is more than just a traffic ticket, isn't it? Zariah met his gaze, a flicker of something raw and intense passing between them. Yes, she said softly. It is. It was about more than just one man's driving record. It was about challenging a culture of impunity. It was about holding those in power accountable for their actions. Because every time I win one of these, she continued, her voice gaining strength, it gets harder for the next cop to lie. It gets harder for them to justify their prejudice. It sets a precedent. She saw a spark of understanding ignite in Mr. Rial's eyes. He was starting to see the bigger picture, the ripple effect of this single victory. The cafe noises faded into the background as a profound silence settled between them. The air crackled with unspoken words, with shared understanding. Zariah felt a surge of something akin to hope. It was a fragile thing easily extinguished, but it was there, a small flame flickering in the darkness, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, change was possible. One case at a time, one victory at a time. The fight was far from over, but for now, in this quiet corner of a bustling cafe, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The weight of the world, for just a fleeting instant, felt a little lighter. The insistent buzzing of her phone pierced through the thin veil of sleep. Zariah reached out, her hand fumbling blindly on the nightstand before connecting with the cool glass. The screen's harsh light assaulted her eyes, displaying a cascade of notifications, missed calls, text messages, emails, all blurring into a single, insistent demand for her attention. She squeezed her eyes shut, the phantom echo of the courtroom still ringing in her ears. Kilroy's face, contorted in disbelief, his initial arrogance replaced by a stunned silence. The memory sent a shiver down her spine. It had been 3 days, but the weight of the moment hadn't lessened. She finally swiped to answer a call from an unknown number. "Zariah Benton?" A brisk, unfamiliar voice inquired. Another reporter. This was the 5th one today. She'd already spoken to 2 local news channels, a national network, and a legal podcast. Each conversation replayed the events of the trial, dissecting her every move, every word. The sudden onslaught of attention was disorienting, a whirlwind she hadn't anticipated. "Yes, speaking," she replied, her voice raspy from lack of sleep. "Why am I even answering these?" she thought, a flicker of irritation surfacing. "This isn't what I wanted." The reporter launched into a series of rapid-fire questions, praising her brilliant legal maneuvering, her David versus Goliath victory. The words felt hollow, disconnected from the gnawing unease in her stomach. "I appreciate the compliments," she interrupted, her tone sharper than intended. "But I don't care about going viral." The line went momentarily silent. Zariah could almost hear the reporter's surprise through the phone. "I care about what happens next," she continued, her voice regaining its composure. "It doesn't feel like a win until the system stops giving officers like Kilroy the benefit of the doubt." She disconnected the call, the silence of her apartment feeling heavy, almost suffocating. The city lights painted long, distorted shadows on her walls. The cityscape outside her window a stark contrast to the quiet turmoil brewing within her. She hadn't slept properly since the verdict. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the body cam footage playing, the blatant disregard for her client's rights, the casual arrogance in Kilroy's demeanor. She walked to the window, the cool glass a soothing balm against her heated skin. The city hummed below, a symphony of distant sirens and car horns, each sound a reminder of the countless unseen injustices playing out every day. Her victory against Kilroy felt like a tiny ripple in a vast ocean. She had exposed one instance of misconduct, but how many more went unnoticed, unchallenged? The thought sent a wave of exhaustion washing over her. The fight, she realized, was far from over. The news reports, however, painted a different picture. They portrayed her as a legal prodigy, a young champion of justice. The videos of her cross-examination were being shared across social media platforms, her sharp words echoing in countless virtual spaces. Her name, once unknown outside her small circle of colleagues and clients, was now synonymous with defiance, with hope. She had become a symbol, a representation of the fight against systemic injustice. But symbols didn't change systems. Symbols didn't dismantle deeply ingrained biases. She knew that the true victory wouldn't come from viral fame or fleeting media attention. It would come from slow, painstaking work, from chipping away at the foundations of a system that often favored power over truth. It would come from holding individuals accountable, from demanding transparency, from fighting for real, lasting change. She thought about Mr. Rial's, the quiet dignity he maintained throughout the ordeal, the relief in his eyes when the judge delivered the not guilty verdict. That, she thought, was what mattered. His freedom, his vindication, the restoration of his faith in a system that had tried to fail him. News of Kilroy's suspension reached her. A few days later, it wasn't enough. It was a temporary reprimand, a slap on the wrist for a man who had abused his authority. But it was a start, a small crack in the wall of impunity. Zariah knew that the internal investigation would be long and arduous, filled with bureaucratic hurdles and political maneuvering. She was prepared for the fight. She had already started compiling a detailed report, documenting Kilroy's past conduct, highlighting patterns of biased policing. This, she realized, was the next battleground. The fight wouldn't be confined to the courtroom. It would extend into the corridors of power, into the very heart of the system she was determined to change. The incessant ringing of her phone broke the silence once again. This time it was her mentor, Mr. Henderson. "Zariah," he said, his voice warm with pride. "You've created a ripple effect. People are talking. They're demanding accountability." His words brought a flicker of hope to the exhaustion she felt. Perhaps, she thought, the viral fame wasn't entirely meaningless. Perhaps it could be a catalyst, a spark that ignited a larger movement. "It's just the beginning, Mr. Henderson," she replied, her voice filled with a newfound resolve. "We have a long way to go." The weight on her chest hadn't entirely lifted, but it had shifted. The exhaustion remained, but it was now mingled with a quiet determination, a steeling of her resolve. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in days, Zariah felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of purpose that transcended the fleeting spotlight of viral fame. She was ready for what came next. The fluorescent lights of the community center hummed, a dull counterpoint to the excited chatter filling the room. Zariah adjusted the microphone, a familiar flutter of nerves dancing in her stomach. It wasn't a courtroom, but the faces looking back at her held a similar intensity, a hunger for something more. This was the youth legal program, a place where dreams of justice were nurtured, where the seeds of change were sown. She'd been here countless times as a student, soaking in every word, every story of legal battles fought and won. Now she stood at the front not as a student but as a victor. Her gaze swept across the room, taking in the diverse group of teenagers, their eyes bright with anticipation. She remembered that feeling, that raw mix of hope and uncertainty. "They see themselves in me," she thought, a reflection of what they could become. It was a heavy responsibility, one she didn't take lightly. The victory against Officer Kilroy had been more than a personal triumph. It had become a symbol, a beacon of hope for a community weary of injustice. "I stood in that courtroom," Zariah began, her voice soft yet steady, "facing a man who had the weight of the system behind him, a man who thought he was untouchable." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, watching as they landed on the young faces before her. "Show them the vulnerability," her inner voice urged. "Let them see the struggle behind the strength." "He laughed," she continued, a flicker of a memory crossing her face. The condescending smirk, the dismissive tone, it was etched into her mind. "He laughed when I presented the body cam footage. He laughed when I pointed out the discrepancies in his report. He laughed because he thought I was nothing more than a naive law student playing lawyer." She could feel the anger simmering beneath her calm exterior, a controlled burn that fueled her resolve. A young girl in the front row raised her hand, her brow furrowed. "Why did he laugh, Miss Benton? Didn't he know he was wrong?" Zariah met her gaze, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "Because they laugh when they feel safe. I don't give them that." The words hung in the air, sharp and precise. "They laugh because they underestimate you. They underestimate your preparation, your intelligence, your commitment to the truth. And that, she thought, is their biggest mistake." She clicked through the slides, projecting the key pieces of evidence onto the screen: the grainy body cam footage, the meticulously highlighted sections of the police report. She walked them through the process, step by step, explaining her strategy, her reasoning, her meticulous attention to detail. "You're going to walk into rooms where people think you don't belong. Rooms where they'll try to silence you, dismiss you, make you feel small. But you," she emphasized, her voice gaining strength, "you have the power to change that, prove yourself right, every single time." The air in the room crackled with a newfound energy, a palpable shift from apprehension to empowerment. Zariah could see it in their eyes, the spark of understanding, the dawning realization that they too could wield the law as a weapon against injustice. She continued, her voice taking on a cadence born of conviction. "Don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Don't be afraid to speak truth to power. Don't be afraid to be the voice for those who have been silenced." The words resonated within her, echoing the lessons she had learned from her own mentors, from the countless hours spent poring over legal texts, from the fire that burned within her to make a difference. As the workshop drew to a close, A young man in the back raised his hand hesitantly. But Ms. Benton, what if we fail? What if we try our best and still lose? Zariah paused, considering his question. The courtroom, the judge's gavel, the weight of expectation, it all flashed before her eyes. Losing a battle doesn't mean losing the war, she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. Every case, every challenge, every setback, it's a lesson learned. It's an opportunity to grow stronger, to refine your strategy, to come back even more prepared. She looked at each of them, her gaze holding a mixture of empathy and resolve. The fight for justice is a marathon, not a sprint. There will be setbacks, there will be disappointments, but as long as you keep fighting, as long as you keep believing, you will make a difference. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling upon them. Zariah gathered her things, a sense of fulfillment washing over her. The battle against Officer Kilroy had been a turning point, not just in her career, but in her life. It had solidified her purpose, ignited a fire within her to fight for a more just world. And now, standing before these young faces, she felt a glimmer of hope that her victory would ripple outwards, inspiring a new generation of legal advocates to take up the mantle. The fight was far from over, but she knew, deep in her heart, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the quiet murmur of hope that filled the room.